Welcome to the 6th episode of The Diversity Imperative, a podcast dedicated to unearthing the agriculture sector's potential. We'll talk with diverse voices and industry leaders to motivate listeners to take their organizations, whether it's the family farm or a life science company, to the next level when it comes to stewarding their most important resource, people. My name is Hannah Conchu, and I'm a grain farmer from Clooney, Alberta.
And I'm Erin Gowerlock, and I lead a national grower association in the nation's capital. Our goal each episode will be to dig into some great conversations that go beyond 280 characters and that seek to inspire a broader dialogue engaging all people in our sector, regardless of gender, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, or ability. Through rich and candid conversations, which consider a variety of perspectives, we look forward to exploring ways to overcome barriers and make diversity and inclusion a topic that everyone is comfortable talking about. Today, we're joined by Dr. Melissa Arcand, Assistant Professor and Soil Biogeochemist from the University of Saskatchewan. Melissa's research interests focus on optimizing plant-soil synergies for the design of nutrient and energy-efficient cropping systems. She received her PhD in soil science from the University of Saskatchewan and conducted her postdoctoral research with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada.
Melissa also grew up on a farm on the Muskeg Lake Cree Nation in central Saskatchewan. She teaches and is the academic advisor for students in the Kanawayihetaytan Askiy program, designed to train students to work in resource management and land governance in Indigenous communities across Canada. Her emerging work uses biophysical tools to examine the effects of agriculture and land tenure arrangements on ecosystem health on First Nations land. Thanks so much for joining us tonight, Melissa.
Thanks, Hannah and Erin. It's really exciting to be here with you two.
So I think our listeners are going to see a pattern when I say that I'm super excited to talk to you, but I'm personally just super jazzed that you're joining us tonight because you and we're old soil science colleagues.
That's right. Yeah, we spent many hours shoulder to shoulder working on doing soil analyses. So that was a really fun time.
Yeah, for sure. And I was thinking back, and I think that I started listening to podcasts because of you. I remember we were doing an analysis one day and you said, let's turn on a podcast. And I think that's actually how it all started for me. So
yeah, I'm definitely a podcast addict.
Yeah.
Sure. It gets you through the long hours of whatever tedious work you might be doing and solitarily. So
totally. And now that I find myself in equipment a lot, it's what I need to keep my brain going. So glad to be able to do that.
That's awesome.
So I thought we could start with you sharing with us what it looks like for you to be a soil scientist and a professor in a university setting, because I think that probably on the surface, most people understand that looks like you're contributing work to you're contributing science to a body of work, but maybe not all the different components that go into that, like teaching and all those sorts of things. So what does that look like for you?
Yeah, it's definitely a lot more diverse than I think most people in the general public might understand, like the job of a professor to be. Most people probably imagine us in front of a classroom and spending a lot of our time teaching undergrad students. But there's, it's really diverse and dynamic and probably oftentimes really busy. But yeah, I would say that, my time is split between teaching undergrad courses, but then also mentoring graduate students. Like that's probably a big part of my time is involving mentoring grad students in conducting their own research, that contributes to them writing their thesis and, eventually becoming experts in their own right. And then another part of, our time is spent like chasing money and writing grants that support our research and actually that enable us to have the funds to actually hire graduate students that can then do the work. Because a lot of the hands-on research is actually done by grad students and research technicians and postdocs and undergrad students. Gone are the days where like I get to be in the lab on a day-to-day basis. And it's kind of sad because I think we get into research because we love being in the field or we love being in the lab. But often eventually that evolves to us supporting other people who get to do that work. So yeah, it's pretty diverse. It's pretty dynamic. Every day is kind of different. And now that we're in the pandemic COVID world and working from home, it's a lot of meetings, and we don't necessarily get to do a lot of the face-to-face learning that happens is not really an option anymore. So it's been a big adaptation.
Oh, I'm sure it has.
Yeah.
And I was one of those grad students who was mentored by a soil scientist. Well, actually two. So I'm just so appreciative of that work that you do to keep mentoring, future researchers that are going to go off and do great things in the world. So that's wonderful. So thinking back to 2019, you were the invited scholar to the Waywani Indigenous Scholars Speaker Series at the University of Winnipeg. And you gave this amazing presentation called Understanding from the Land. And we've been calling it Melissa's TED Talk because we've watched it a few times and just appreciated everything that you shared during that talk so much. And it just really gave a fantastic history of Indigenous agriculture on the prairies and our prairie history, really. And so we're probably going to reference it a bunch here tonight. So we'll make sure to link to that in our show notes. But you started off that talk by sort of connecting the work that you do as a natural scientist or a soil scientist practicing sort of Western science, and how that sort of intersects with or is informed by Indigenous knowledge systems. So I was hoping you could just make that connection for us again, and how that might sort of inform the work that goes on to manage land or managed by Indigenous communities and land leaders there.
So I was trained in the natural sciences, and my whole academic background has been in knowing how to do Western science. And but it does, certainly when it comes to studying the land and the way the environment works, the way ecosystems work, the way ecological relationships are understood, also really strongly connects with Indigenous ways of knowing and understanding what those, say, for example, processes might be, ecological relationships. And for me, that question about trying to connect Indigenous knowledge systems with Western science is an ongoing, lifelong process. And I think, at least for me personally, because of my academic background, and in probably just the age that I am, which, like, I'm still pretty young. I'm, an elder millennial, let's say. But even for me at my age and growing up in the 80s, there was still a lot of like really clear impacts of the residential school system and of the ways in which Indigenous kids, when we were growing up, were kind of assimilated into, or being forced to assimilate into Western culture. So in spite of having the opportunity to grow up in my own community and, be exposed to my language growing up and to many cultural aspects and traditional practices, there is still a lot of, when I went training in my undergrad and graduate school, you sort of, in some ways, had to set some of those things aside, and didn't have to, but you sort of felt like you were being trained in one way. And what I'm really encouraged by now is that Indigenous people who get into the STEM fields aren't doing that. Like, the next generation of students are really revitalizing and reclaiming their cultural identity, while also learning, Western methods and Western scientific approaches to understanding the environment. So for me, I'm kind of trying to as well understand those Indigenous knowledge systems and help myself like better enable the Western science that I have to hopefully provide good change and good land management decisions that can happen within the context of Indigenous land management. So it's complicated because there's a history of assimilation that has caused many of us to lose a lot of our our knowledge, a lot of our traditional knowledge and language. And so in terms of connecting that, again, my Western science background to Indigenous knowledge systems, it's an ongoing process, and it's kind of connecting back to community members, to elders, to knowledge keepers, and trying to find the commonalities. And I think the best way that I've been able to experience it so far is actually being out on the land together. And, if Hannah, like, you're a soil scientist and you did field work, and what gets a soil scientist more excited than actually being out in the field and digging a hole and, grabbing a chunk of soil in their hands and, starting to sort of characterize it and look across the landscape and understand why, that soil in that spot is the way it is because of all of these factors. And so when you can start to just talk about the land and talk about the landscape and talk about the history, that engages everybody. Like that engages the traditional knowledge about that land, that engages like the oral history that tells us stories about that land. And so it's sort of a common place where, different understandings can merge together. And to be able to explain phenomena that we both observe, but in different ways. So, that part, again, I think it's really complicated. I think there's probably scholars that have done a lot of work on this that are, can better explain this than I can, because I still feel very much like a learner in this realm.
And it sort of seems like it's like a lens that the work needs to be seen through, because that disconnect happened. And then you sort of spoke to how the history of the land and sort of the practices that were done by Indigenous elders, those practices that were carried out, they're kind of lost in some cases. So just being able to sort of bring that lens to the work that's going on seems pretty important.
Yeah, and actually I can maybe give a couple of concrete examples about how the Indigenous worldview and perspectives change the way that land management decisions might be made, like in a real practical sense. So for example, this past summer in my home community, there was just sort of an abundance of black bears for whatever variety of reasons, the population of black bears was really increasing in the community. And there was concerns, obviously about human bear interactions, wanting to make sure people are safe and kids are safe. And the land manager was very concerned about listening to the elders, in that, he wasn't going to, have the bear be killed. So, and that was because of the relationship that the elders had said is really important between the community and the bear. The bear is like a brother, and you don't just shoot your brother because, he happens to be living in the same space that you are. It's his territory just as much as it's yours. So it makes for sometimes more complicated solutions to be found. And so, in the end, there had been no issues between any bears and the community members, and it seemed to end up being fine, but it was still like a conversation that was had. And one that they really were considering and really kind of grappling with. Okay, well, the solution can't just be that we kill this bear. And then another example that I can give is working with somebody who was in charge of managing some land that was going to be restored, so that bison could return to that piece of land. And that the history of that land was, it was grain cropped for many years and under, conventional practices. And at some point there in time, municipal sewage sludge had been applied to the land. And so there was concerns as well, even just about when restoring land that had been under, conventional production to native grassland, weeds are a concern. And so this land manager was really grappling with how to control for weeds, because they didn't want to have to rely on herbicide use. And so again, it's one of these things where, because of the cultural view of not wanting to, kill and use synthetic chemical to do that, forces harder solutions or more creative solutions to be found. And so, these are like really practical, contemporary land management decisions that communities are grappling with, or individuals are grappling with, and they're grappling with it in part because of the cultural understandings of our relationship to those other beings, those other animate and inanimate, beings that are our relatives. So it creates another lens to look at some of these decisions. And so, I guess it's kind of like points towards how some of these things aren't simple.
A less widely held understanding of our prairie history is that First Nations people were practicing intentional land management and agriculture on the prairies prior to colonialization. What did this look like?
I think depending where you are, here you're asking specifically about the prairies. So again, the example that I gave, or that I often give, is that relationship between the bison, the grassland, and fire. So prescribed burning is something that's been practiced by Indigenous communities on the prairies and elsewhere too. In forest management, prescribed burning is really important to forest management. But on the prairies, fire is that critical disturbance, along with grazing, that rejuvenates the grasses and the grasslands. And so, so Indigenous people employed fire intentionally, and because it would stimulate growth of the grass again, and that would then bring, the bison would then be able to feed on that, fresh, that really nice green new grass. So, there's a way that, again, it's more ecologically based, but there's still like an intentionality in determining, well, where are you going to burn? That's a decision, right? It's not just a haphazard interaction with the landscape and the, all of the components of the environment. It's an intentional, it's a decision that's being made. And so that's management. Anytime that a decision is being made that alters the landscape and the organisms that are in that ecosystem, that's a management decision. At least that's what I would consider to be a management decision. So even on the prairies where maybe agriculture wasn't, sort of the cultivation of crops of specific, crop species, and maybe there wasn't necessarily selection of and breeding of cultivars, let's say, there was still at least an interaction with the land that was intentional, that was sort of a management system. And as well, in North America and throughout the whole Americas, there's massive trade networks. So communities that may have not practiced agriculture in the way of, thinking about growing corn, for example, were certainly aware of other communities elsewhere on the continent that were, because those things were passed along via trade. So, so there was at least an understanding, that people were harvesting and growing, plants for cultivation. And certainly in our area, in northern Saskatchewan and in Ontario, in the Great Lakes region, wild rice was a staple crop. And so there's a whole tradition around harvesting and around the whole sort of ecology and management of those wild rice systems as well. So, there was a lot of, sort of quote unquote, well, I'm going to erase those quotes, agricultural management that was taking place prior to, settlement of the prairies and European settlement and bringing about, European practices in agriculture.
Absolutely. So I think maybe there's maybe an understanding held that the First Nations people were they sort of wandered. They were just kind of doing stuff here and there. But really, we're talking about intentional decisions, understanding what's going on in the landscape and using that to sustain themselves. So very much so intentional in what they were doing.
Yeah, absolutely.
So then to fast forward a bit, so European contact happens and the prairies start to be turned over into sort of more like traditional agriculture. So growing one crop, turning the land. And First Nations farmers were also doing that as well, based on what was going on. When I think back to your talk, you gave you showed a really cool picture of First Nations farmers using modern equipment at that time. And I think you mentioned that they had been, they were, early adopters of using Massey Ferguson equipment. So they were, and it turns out that they were very successful at what they were doing. And part of that success maybe came from carrying forward some of their traditional ways of being. So sharing knowledge, sharing work, sharing equipment. But then what happens is, my timelines might not be quite on point here, but a number of policies sort of start to rear their ugly heads and sort of set back the success that First Nation farmers are having, and really all First Nations people. And I know it's a lot to unpack in one conversation, but we were sort of hoping that we could touch on what some of those most detrimental things were that happened and that really started to affect First Nations farmers and the agriculture they were practicing.
Yeah, there were quite a number of policies and actions that the government implemented, in the late 1800s and at different times throughout the early 20th century as well. And really a lot of the examples were all about not only controlling movement of people, but also movement of produce and agricultural implements and basically control over the ability to engage in the agricultural economy. Yeah, so I would definitely encourage people to go to some of the historical works that have been done by historians and scholars who've done that really historical dive deep. And so that would be Sarah Carter, who wrote Lost Harvest. That's probably the seminal work in that area. And then we have James Dashak, who wrote Clearing of the Plains. And that really kind of focused in on how disease and starvation were sort of instruments of colonization. And then there's also another book that is really specific about some of these policies called From Wooden Plows to Welfare, and it's written by Helen Buckley. And so there's some really good historical works that are written by scholars, historians, unlike me, who is a soil scientist, but has learned some of this over the years, and even just from family history as well. But getting back to some of these policies and actions that the government implemented, probably the big two were related to the pass and permit systems. So the pass system affected all First Nations people that lived on First Nations reserve lands. And in order for individuals to leave the reserve, to leave the boundaries of the reserve, they needed to get a pass that the Indian agent would sign, which would indicate that that person had permission to leave the reserve. So if you went into town, somebody, the police could ask you to show your pass to indicate that you were allowed to leave the reserve. And so there was the pass system, which really, sought to control movement of people. But then there was the permit system, and the permit system was similar to the pass system. But what that was, is it required First Nations farmers who were farming on land on the reserve. So maybe they were growing wheat, or they were raising cattle or pigs or chickens or whatever, they would need to have a permit that was also signed by the Indian agent, allowing them to sell their produce. So you can imagine where you have a system that, let's say, for example, that Indian agent wanted to make a buck or didn't like an individual, they had a lot of control over what was leaving the reserve in terms of being able to, sell things. So there was a huge amount of control, again, over engagement in the wider economy. And it could really pit individuals within the community against each other if one was being favored by the Indian agent over another. So both of those, and they weren't even actually legislated policy. These were just actions that at the time, Indian Affairs implemented through the Indian agent to be able to impose these things. But they were in place until, in some places, I think, until the 1960s. So not that long ago. So those two things were really detrimental. And then another thing, another policy was the peasant farming policy. And this required First Nations farmers to essentially adopt subsistence forms of agriculture. And what this meant even was that they couldn't use modern farm equipment. They were encouraged to actually make their own tools. So wooden tools as opposed to, steel, let's say, for example. And because, of course, they weren't, if they were not allowed to purchase new farm equipment, or they weren't allowed to, buy the tools to fix old farm equipment, and they were forced to use, basically subsistence style agricultural tools, then again, not able to compete and participate in the broader economy, the broader agricultural economy. So again, that had like really damaging effects on some of the progress that was being made.
I want to ask about that, because it seems like the system was set up, the treaties were negotiated, and they said, here, this is what you're allowed to do. And then they start farming and being potentially successful, right? They've got things to sell and they want to interact with the economy and make money. And then it was like, no, we're going to add something else in there to set you back even further. So that to me is just wild that, yeah. And like you say, that the pass and permit system wasn't actually legal. They were just
doing it.
Yeah.
I mean, it was racism in the sense of not wanting this group of people to compete with the European settlers who were promised a brand new life, right? So a lot of European settlers who ultimately, started farming on the prairies were coming from their own harsh conditions of Europe. And they were promised this new life where they would be able to establish these brand new farms and participate in the economy of this new world, quote unquote. And so, if they're being outcompeted by the Indigenous population, that's, and because of racism as well, it wasn't thought of as like, oh, the success of these people can, leverage and, result in the success of these new settlers. No, it was like a competition thing, right? And that was born out of racism. And there was also the aspects of control, because, not every Indigenous person necessarily wanted to become a farmer. Like, people still wanted to practice their traditional relationships to the land in terms of hunting and fishing and, being able to move freely across traditional territory that was being eaten up by farmland. And so to be able to control people's movements, because, they were used to moving from, their summer camp versus their winter camp and versus gathering places, right? That free movement was detrimental to this concept of private ownership of the land. And, in Indigenous culture, especially, at least here, which I can speak to more freely about, is that the concept of ownership, like of individual ownership of the land, is just completely foreign concept. And so, in order, it's like a cultural clash, right? We have European settlers who from their culture, this idea of individual ownership of land is is something that's part of the culture and what they were promised, whereas the Indigenous culture didn't have that worldview. And so, part of these policies also stemmed to keep control of the Indigenous population. And also because, in the Métis Rebellion, a lot of Indigenous people and First Nations who actually had signed treaty didn't participate in the Métis Rebellion because they were honoring treaty, but nevertheless, the government sort of groups together, control of those communities or individuals that participated in the rebellion and encompass that, to the broader Indigenous population as a whole. So it was really, about control and about, and about quelling competition.
Mm-hmm. So the success that the European settlers had was basically, it was off the backs of First Nations people. So I just think that this is, I'm so glad you mentioned all those resources, right? Because there's so much to know and so much to learn there. But I'm just glad that you were able to touch on a few of those key policies, because I think I've heard it said that it's very important, and I agree with this, that it's very important to understand what happened so that we can then, move forward meaningfully. So yeah, I'm just so glad that you were able to touch on that with us.
Yeah, for sure.
So there's also really a key soil quality or capability piece that relates, Melissa, to how land from reserves was surrendered or given to returning non-Indigenous war veterans after the Second World War, I believe. Can you speak to how this occurred and how this eroded the land base and the quality of the soil that was held by First Nations reserves?
Yeah, following actually there was a number of mechanisms or reasons that the Crown essentially caused reserve land to be surrendered, and it was sold. So it was surrendered by sale. So some of these reasons were like expansion of the railway, and other development, but also like a big one that I'm more familiar with because it's affected my own community was through the Soldier Settlement Act. And so land surrenders that were basically promoted in order to eventually then be able to support these returning World War I veterans to be able to get really basically cheap land upon their return from the war. And so through the soldier settlement land surrenders, a lot of land was surrendered. And I think across the prairies, something like 20% of the reserve land base was surrendered through a number of these mechanisms, not just the soldier settlement, but also through railway expansion as well. And it's like almost 300,000 acres in Saskatchewan was surrendered due to some of, a number of these reasons. But the irony with a lot of these surrenders is that the government, their pitch to the community to convince them to sell the land back to the government was so that then the community could take the proceeds of that sale so that they could buy farm equipment. Or in one case, the community wanted to purchase material so they could build a fence to protect against cattle from moving onto their land or moving so that they contain their own cattle, but also so that their cattle wouldn't get mixed with the European settlers' cattle. And so the irony is that what ended up happening is that oftentimes, these sort of dealings were done under quite shady conditions, such that they were never able to purchase that farm equipment, or they were never able to build that fence. But those purchases, and the proceeds were really intended to better enable agriculture to happen. But what actually happened is that, for the most part, a lot of our really good land was actually what was sold. And so there's been a number of specific claims that have, been successful, where communities have been able to demonstrate legally that the sale was done under nefarious conditions, for example. And so this has enabled quite a number of communities to be able to, win these battles in court, and then turn around and in modern day use those funds to purchase land. But certainly there's no coincidence that the best land was the land that was surrendered. And, at the time, under different stories in different communities for why this happened, but oftentimes, there was definitely some convincing and lies, and oftentimes, votes would have to be made at the community level to enable that sale to happen. And oftentimes they'd find no record of the vote. So it could have been one person making a deal with the Indian agent, and all this land that was supposed to be held communally was then gone in a flash, right? And so a lot of there's been a lot of historical research that supported these specific claims that have shown, basically all of these pretty shady dealings that occurred. And this was, if we consider 300,000 acres that was ultimately surrendered, this isn't just a case by case kind of thing. This was, an institutional mandate in some ways, maybe not officially, but it was definitely something that was a strategy to gain land that could be used by settlers.
I sort of wonder why weren't they interested in taking, I assume there was crown land at the time. I guess it was just what was the easiest thing to take was likely the really good quality soil from First Nations reserves.
Yeah, exactly. Because there was quite a bit of land that was high quality Class 1, Class 2 land that was surrendered.
Yeah, and during the talk that you gave, you had the slide up there that showed what Muskeg Lake Nation looked like before and then after, and then all the different sort of polygons of soil quality. So when you see it like that, it's quite remarkable how much of that really good quality soil was lost.
Yeah, and totally, like I said, not a coincidence.
And of course, I mean, there was, we shouldn't mince words about it. There was a lot of damage done there and oppression. But I think a really hopeful thing, some really hopeful work that's going on is the work that you lead that looks to sort of revitalize Indigenous agriculture and some of that knowledge. So I'd love for you to tell us about the work that you've led and that you continue to lead that works to determine what's needed to continue to revitalize Indigenous agriculture into the future, and the work that you do sort of more on a individual basis that empowers land managers on First Nations to manage their own land.
Yeah, sure. So a few years ago, myself and a few collaborators actually from Indigenous organizations and First Nations, and then some other faculty members that were from the social sciences actually, we put together a forum on Indigenous agriculture in Saskatchewan. So this was about 3 years ago now, and it was remarkable how much interest we had in people wanting to attend. And initially, we were restricted in some ways by the funding that we had and about the physical space that we were able to have a conference held. And we basically got the word out, and within like 2 days, we were at like fire code capacity. And so it was really exciting to see how much interest there was and by Indigenous communities and staff within First Nations communities that were interested in attending and participating in this. And so the purpose of that forum was really to do a lot of information gathering, just about like what kind of activities were communities and organizations engaged in either Indigenous land management that pertain to agricultural lands, or in activities that involve growing food, raising livestock directly by communities or by First Nations individuals. And so it was great because it was very much like just wanting to get a survey of sort of what the landscape looked like. And indeed, we've had participation from all scales of agriculture, from community gardens, growing heirloom, indigenous varieties of, different vegetable crops and horticultural crops from across North America that, were adapted to our climate. So small scale like that, all the way to First Nations that are operating, thousands of acre size grain farms. So, and everything kind of in between. And so it was great because it did bring in a lot of a varied perspective and largely from the Indigenous community. So the forum itself was majority attended by Indigenous people. There was academics of all backgrounds and heritages that were there, as well as government representatives and other people from the ag industry or from environmental NGOs. But for the most part, the majority of the participants were Indigenous, and it was wonderful because it really enabled kind of a really safe, open atmosphere for conversation. People weren't really holding back and were sort of open with their ideas and just a way of interacting. And so that was sort of the start of a conversation. And unfortunately with COVID, some of these activities have been delayed, and some of the momentum that we had kickstarted with that has been delayed. But I think now that we know so much better how to use these online platforms, I'm hoping anyways that over the summer and into the fall, we can do some more of these activities that are online based, that we can kind of continue some of that work that we started with, just kind of getting a broader sort of scope of what's happening. And so that's kind of one piece that I've been working on. And I'll have to say, it's been very collaborative. Like it's been, myself, but then all of these other experts who've been able to come together and sort of form a team to spearhead some of this work. And so we're still working together on projects and grants and hoping that we can move this forward. But for me as well, some of the work that I'm doing, the research work that I'm doing is more focused right now on land management and working with First Nations land managers who are managing agricultural lands. And so in large part, what this means is actually their big role is acting as a landlord. So much of the land is leased to neighboring farmers. And a lot of the First Nations land managers are really interested in understanding what are the impacts of agricultural management on their land. They have a pretty good understanding of their landscape and of all of the activities that are going on their land, but there's still concerns about, let's say, for example, water quality, whether or not soils might be degraded, whether or not, spraying, for example, might be affecting adjacent, natural areas and ability for people to harvest berries or medicine, that sort of thing. And so I'm working with them specifically right now on a project that's focused on soil. And one of the key questions that comes up time and time again when I talk to First Nations land managers is they want to know, are we charging enough for our land? And for a lot of communities, they might charge just a blanket rate across the whole reserve, but there could be, quite a lot of variability in terms of the land productivity, the land capability. And so, I'm working with them in large part to just collect some baseline soil data, and in a lot of the way, a lot of the intention there is even just to become as like a learning and teaching strategy of becoming knowledgeable about, what is soil, what does it do, and how does careful management of the soil lend towards long-term, sustainable stewardship of the land. And so, a big part of our work is working directly with the communities to actually go out and soil sample and have those conversations on the land. And then ultimately, we'll get a sheet of data that tells us how much organic matter is in the soil, what the nutrient status is, whether or not there's salinity and then have a conversation about what those numbers mean. So we're doing that now, and that's what I'll be going to the field tomorrow to do, is to work with one of the communities that we're working with to sample a whole bunch of soil.
Awesome.
Yeah.
I love that, because I mean, if you think about what's going on land that's being farmed by non-Indigenous farmers, like land rent it's up for negotiation, right? Based on what's going on. So I think it just, yeah, and I'm so glad that the work is going on to empower First Nations leaders to be able to make all those decisions and have all this knowledge that they need to have
all the data for themselves. You know, like for a lot of farmers, you work with agronomists, you're doing soil testing, you're doing all of these other, you have yield data from every year. But the land managers in the community don't have that historical data. And they don't necessarily have all of those records. So some communities are starting to demand that information as part of their lease agreements, because then you can start monitoring changes, right? And if you see something change, and if you see something decline, that there's some external factor that's causing that to happen, right? And so then you can make an management intervention. So it really is about, increasing the amount of information that is at the disposal for decision making.
Mm-hmm. Knowledge is power.
Yeah, I was going to say that, but
trust me to bring in the cheesy line. I'm good for those. So is that outside the certificate program, the land management certificate program?
Yeah, that's just research project that I'm doing. But I will say that a lot of the students that come through the program, because they end up working as land managers, I continue to, see them at various workshops and conferences, and we continue to, find ways to work together. So now a lot of them have become colleagues instead of students. And so that's really cool, because they really form like a great network with each other as well. And they support each other kind of as they go further into their careers.
Wonderful.
Yeah, it's really cool.
Well, thanks so much, Melissa. We've picked your brain for so much information tonight, and I'm just so glad we did.
You're very welcome. I was really happy to participate. Hopefully this is clear.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, I one of the reasons why we wanted to have this conversation with you is because I think it lays a really nice foundation for more conversations we want to keep having in future seasons of the Diversity Imperative Pod. So just want to thank you so much for your time, for being so generous with your time and your knowledge.
Well, you're welcome. And yeah, thanks for including this part of the history and contemporary situation. I think it's really cool that you guys are involving Indigenous perspectives.
I learned a lot today, Melissa, and Hannah's right. It really just served as an introduction for me. There's so much more that I want to know. So we'll look forward to having you back another time to dig into some of what we've touched on today. Thank you. For sure.
You're welcome.
And thanks very much to our listeners for tuning in to the 6th and final episode of Season 1 of the Diversity Imperative. The podcast will be taking a break for #Plant21, but Hannah and I look forward to our summer series, so stay tuned for more information on that. Until then, the conversation continues, as always, on Twitter at Diversity in Ag or on Facebook and Instagram at Diversity Imperative.